In the mountains of southwestern Vermont, in the years between 1945 and 1950, 5 people vanished without explanation. They did not disappear in remote wilderness far from civilization. They did not vanish during storms or floods or any obvious natural disaster. They disappeared on well-traveled trails, on clear days and dark nights. It's in conditions that should have made survival straightforward, in a region where experienced search teams subsequently combed thousands of acres of forest and found nothing. Not a body, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace of what had happened to any of them. The disappearances clustered around Glastenbury Mountain in Bennington County, a region that has carried a strange reputation since before European settlement. A place the Abenaki people historically avoided, or that early settlers found unsettling in ways they struggled to articulate, and that has generated unexplained reports for centuries before and after the 5 cases that gave it its name, the Bennington Triangle, a name coined in 1992 by author and folklorist Joseph Citro, deliberately echoing the Bermuda Triangle. Not a precisely defined geography, but a pattern, a concentration of strange events in a specific place that, more than 70 years after the last disappearance, all remains genuinely unsolved. The first disappearance in the cluster occurred on November 12, 1945, and it involved a man who, by any ordinary measure, had no business vanishing on a trail in Vermont. Middy Rivers was 74 years old, a local hunting guide of long experience who knew the land around Glastenbury Mountain intimately. He had spent decades in those forests. He knew the trails, the terrain, the seasonal conditions, and the particular personality of the mountain. On the day he disappeared, he was leading a group of 4 hunters back toward camp after a day in the field. Rivers was slightly ahead of the group on a stream trail he had traveled many times before. The other 4 hunters fell briefly behind. When they caught up with where Rivers should have been, he was not there. He had vanished from a position between 2 groups of people on a trail that dead-ended in manageable wilderness, in full daylight, without any sound, without any cry, or without any indication that anything had gone wrong. An extensive search by experienced outdoorsmen who knew the terrain as well as Rivers had found nothing. Middy Rivers was never seen again. The second disappearance occurred on December 1st, 1946, and has become the most discussed of the 5 cases. Paula Weldon was 18 years old, a sophomore at Bennington College, and that December afternoon she decided to hike the long trail near Glastenbury Mountain alone, as she was seen by multiple witnesses as she made her way to the trailhead. She had hitchhiked to the area, and various people recalled seeing her on the road and at the trail entrance. A couple named Ernest and Margaret Whitman were hiking the same trail that afternoon and observed Weldon ahead of them on the path. She was wearing a red parka, clearly visible against the winter forest. The Whitmans maintained close enough distance that she could not have moved off the trail without them hearing her. Then, as they rounded a bend with clear visibility for a considerable distance ahead, Paula Weldon was simply not there. The trail ahead was empty. She had not passed them going back. She had not turned onto any visible side path. She was there, and then she was not, on a trail with nowhere to disappear in the time and distance available. Paula Weldon was never found. Her disappearance prompted the creation of the Vermont State Police. Vermont had no state police before this case, and the inadequacy of the investigative response was one of the factors that drove its establishment. The third disappearance is peculiar in a different way because it involved a person who had previously survived being lost in the same area. James Tedford was a veteran and resident of the Bennington Soldiers' Home who disappeared on December 1st, 1949. Exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon vanished. He had been visiting relatives in St. Albans and was returning by bus. Fellow passengers confirmed he was aboard as it made its final stop before Bennington. When the bus arrived and passengers disembarked, James Tedford was not among them. His luggage was still in the rack above his seat. A bus timetable was found open on the empty seat. No one on the bus had seen him get off at any stop. No one had seen anything unusual. James Tedford had vanished from a moving vehicle on a populated road in the middle of the day. And, like all the others, he was never found. The fourth case brought the disappearances closest to what might conventionally be called suspicious circumstances, because it involved a child. 8-year-old Paul Jepson disappeared on October 12, 1950, while his mother was briefly occupied with chores near their farm truck not far from the Glastenbury Mountain zone. She had left him in the truck for a short period. When she returned, he was gone. Paul Jepson was wearing a bright red jacket, the same color as Paula Weldon's parka 4 years earlier, a detail researchers have noted repeatedly. Search dogs tracked his scent along a road toward Glastenbury Mountain and then lost the trail completely. Not gradually, but abruptly, as if the child had simply ceased to leave any olfactory trace at a specific point on the road. Paul Jepson was never found. The fifth and final disappearance in the core cluster occurred just 18 days after Paul Jepson vanished, on October 28, 1950. Frida Langer was 53 years old, an experienced hiker who knew the area around Glastenbury Mountain well. She was hiking with her cousin Herbert Elsner near Somerset Reservoir when she slipped and fell into a stream. She told Elsner to wait while she returned to camp, a short distance away, to change her wet clothing. Elsner waited, and Frida Langer did not return to him and did not return to camp. Search teams with hundreds of participants combed the area. Nothing was found. Then, 7 months later, in May of 1951, Frida Langer's body was found in an area that had been searched multiple times, in a location not remote, not concealed, with no explanation for why it had not been located during months of active searching. The condition of the body had been so affected by time that the cause of death could not be determined. Frida Langer is the only one of the 5 Bennington Triangle victims whose remains were ever recovered. What happened to her remains unknown. What happened to the others remains, in the most literal sense, a complete mystery. The geographical heart of the Bennington Triangle is Glastenbury Mountain itself, a peak of about 3,748 feet at the center of a large area of protected wilderness in Windham County, Vermont. The mountain and surrounding forest form the Glastenbury Wilderness, one of the most remote and least visited wilderness areas in Vermont. The town of Glastenbury is a ghost town, a municipality that attempted and failed to develop through logging and charcoal production, abandoned by its few hundred residents by the early 20th century. Today, Glastenbury has a population of near zero and consists of the mountain, the forest, a few building foundations, and a fire tower at the summit overlooking an unbroken expanse of forest. It is one of the loneliest landscapes in the northeastern United States. not because it is far from civilization in miles, but because the terrain, the forest density, and the absence of anything to attract visitors conspire to keep it empty in a way that feels deliberate. The historical strangeness of the Glastenbury area predates the 1940s disappearances by centuries. The Abenaki people, who inhabited this region of Vermont for thousands of years before European contact, they had specific beliefs about Glastenbury Mountain. It was considered cursed or spiritually dangerous, a place where the four winds met, where the spirit world was unusually close, and where human beings were not meant to spend extended time. The Abenaki did not avoid the mountain out of superstition in any dismissive sense. They avoided it because their knowledge of the landscape, accumulated over generations of intimate habitation, had produced a consistent assessment of the place as dangerous in ways their spiritual framework was the best available language for describing. Whether that assessment was based on practical experience of unusual animal behavior, of navigational disorientation the terrain produced, of magnetic anomalies affecting wayfinding, or of something that cannot be mapped onto modern explanatory categories, we cannot know. What we know is that the avoidance was consistent, culturally embedded, and long predating the events of the 1940s. European settlers who moved into the Glastenbury area during the 18th and 19th centuries reported their own categories of strangeness. There were accounts of unusual sounds, low, resonant vibrations that seemed to come from within the mountain itself rather than from any identifiable surface source, described by multiple witnesses in different eras in similar enough terms that the consistency itself becomes a data point. There were accounts of disorientation, experienced woodsmen, people who had hunted these forests for years, who found themselves circling in familiar terrain, unable to maintain the directional sense that had always served them reliably in every other forest they had ever entered. There were accounts of animals behaving in ways that defied the patterns of normal wildlife behavior, livestock refusing to approach the mountain regardless of conditions, or hunting dogs losing trails abruptly in places where the scent should have been strong and trackable, wildlife conspicuously absent in areas where it should have been present. These accounts are not scientifically rigorous. They are the informal, anecdotal, historical record that accumulates around places that consistently produce unusual experiences. Not proof of anything supernatural, but evidence that something about the Glastenbury area has consistently generated unusual reports from a wide variety of independent observers across a very long time period. The scientific and rational explanations proposed for the Bennington Triangle disappearances are several, and it is important to engage with them seriously. One of the most frequently cited is the terrain itself. The Glastenbury wilderness contains a type of ground cover, dense, interlocking deadfall, deep moss, and bog terrain that can effectively conceal a body for years or indefinitely. Paula Weldon and Midi Rivers and the others who were never found may simply be in the forest, undiscovered not because of any mysterious mechanism, but because the terrain is genuinely capable of concealing human remains for very long periods. The same terrain that makes the wilderness feel disorienting also makes thorough searching genuinely difficult. Conventional ground searches in terrain of this density and character are known to miss things that are in plain sight from a different angle or at a different time of year. Another serious rational explanation involves the specific geography of the mountain and its effect on human navigation. The Glastenbury Mountain has been described by experienced hikers as uniquely disorienting, not because the trails are poorly marked, but because the forest cover, the terrain contouring, and the absence of clear landmarks create conditions where spatial disorientation develops rapidly and is unusually difficult to correct. A person who becomes disoriented in the Glastenbury wilderness faces a situation where the usual corrective behaviors, reorienting to landscape features, the following water downhill, finding a clearing for a sightline, are all impaired by the specific character of the terrain. The forest is dense enough to prevent sightlines. The water drainages are confusing in their direction, and the terrain contours create the subjective experience of walking toward a recognizable landmark while actually moving away from it. This terrain-induced disorientation, combined with the rapid deterioration of a lost hiker's physical condition in cold weather, could account for deaths in locations that subsequent searches failed to locate. The magnetic anomaly hypothesis has also been seriously discussed. Glastenbury Mountain contains significant deposits of magnetite, iron ore, in its geological composition, and magnetite deposits are known to create local disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field. Compass readings near significant magnetite deposits can be unreliable, deflecting by several degrees from true magnetic north. In an era before GPS, when hikers and hunters navigated primarily by compass and terrain features, a compass that consistently read several degrees wrong would produce errors that accumulated with each decision point, driving a navigator progressively off course in ways that would not become apparent until they were significantly lost. Whether the Glastenbury magnetite deposits are extensive enough to produce this effect at the surface has not been systematically studied, but the geological conditions for magnetic anomaly are present, and the navigational consequences of compass unreliability in the pre-GPS era were severe. There is also a more unsettling rational possibility that has never been fully dismissed, that one or more of the disappearances were the result of human violence, and that the clustering of cases reflects not a mysterious landscape, but a predatory human presence that was never identified. Serial killers have operated in rural America throughout its history, and the combination of isolated terrain, low population density, and limited law enforcement response time that characterized Bennington County in the 1940s would have provided favorable conditions for a predator whose methods left no evidence. Vermont had no state police until the Weldon case. Forensic investigation of the era was primitive by modern standards, and the assumption that the missing persons were injured or lost rather than victimized may have directed resources in ways that made the actual evidence harder to find. This explanation does not fit all 5 cases equally. The Tedford disappearance from a moving bus is particularly resistant to human predator theory, but it cannot be dismissed for the others, and it represents a sober alternative to the supernatural framings that the Bennington Triangle name invites. What the Bennington Triangle ultimately confronts us with is the reality that 5 people disappeared in a specific place during a specific period, and the combined investigative effort of nearly 80 years has not produced a complete or satisfying explanation for any of them. The terrain is genuinely unusual. The historical record of strange reports is genuinely long and varied. The concentration of disappearances in 5 years in a specific geographic cluster is statistically improbable if the explanation is purely random bad luck. And the complete absence of remains or evidence from 4 of the 5 cases, despite extensive searches, is genuinely difficult to account for through conventional explanations alone. None of this means the supernatural explanations are correct, or it means the natural explanations have not been sufficiently demonstrated to close the cases, and that they remain open in the most literal sense, unsolved, unexplained, waiting for evidence that may or may not ever exist. The forest above Glastenbury Mountain is the same forest it was in 1945. The trails that Midi Rivers walked are still there. The long trail where Paula Weldon was seen and then simply was not still winds through the same terrain, past the same bend where the Whitmans looked ahead and found an empty path. The mountain has not changed. The wilderness has not developed. The fire tower at the summit still looks out over the same unbroken expanse of forest that has absorbed every searcher, every investigator, and every explanation offered to it without giving anything back in return. And in that compressed, dense, disorienting forest covering the slopes of the most avoided mountain in Vermont, whatever happened to 5 people across 5 years of the mid-20th century? Whether terrain and cold and bad luck, whether a predator who was never caught, whether some quality of the land itself that neither science nor folklore has yet found the right language to describe. Whatever it was, it left no answer behind. Just 5 names. 5 families who never had a final accounting of what happened to someone they loved. 5 unsolved cases in an archive that grows no closer to resolution with each passing year. And a landscape that keeps its secrets in the specific way that old forests keep everything, completely, patiently, and without any apparent intention of ever telling.